Hello everyone, I'm John Smith from Weyburn, Saskatchewan. I serve the Church of Christ here in Weyburn, and it's time for Bible study on a Tuesday evening, and I invite you to join us here. We're studying this evening from 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. It's lesson 12 in a series from the book of 2 Corinthians, and tonight's class will focus on the grace of giving. Okay, the grace of giving. God's grace is expressed through our giving, and we're going to see Paul talk about that to the Corinthian Christians. Before we delve into the text, I want to encourage you to maybe pause the video and read chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians. I am going to go through it, reading most of it, but I'm going to be splitting it up, at times verse by verse, which will split it up into sentences, and that's not ideal, but I want to bring out some specific points, and it would be valuable for you, though, to have read or to afterwards read the whole thing as a single reading instead of having it broken up in the way that I'm going to do it. But let's begin with some background. Paul is going to talk to them about participating in a giving ministry to support people who are suffering in the region of Judea. And so he's challenging Gentile Christians. This is a Gentile church primarily in Corinth, that he's asking to help support Jewish Christians in Judea who have suffered a famine. I'm just going to refer to a couple of notes here to get some dates in that. Emperor Claudius reigned from AD 41 to 54, and it was during this period of time that there was a severe famine in the region of Judea. And so in the aftermath of that, many Gentile churches sent relief. We learn in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 11, verses 27 to 30, that from Antioch, a gift of support is sent to Jerusalem from that Gentile church at Antioch to help support the saints as they are suffering. And Paul talks a little bit about this kind of ministry in Galatians 2 and verse 10. But the most important background for what we're going to see here in 2 Corinthians is actually Paul's instruction to the Corinthians in his first letter that we have in the New Testament that he wrote to them. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. So I'll just read those verses. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of the week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. When I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should also go, they will accompany me. So Paul talks to them in 1 Corinthians about how to be collecting money and saving it up for the time when it's ready to send, to be taken to Jerusalem in this ministry of giving. Okay, and there's some more in 1 Corinthians about that. Now, in the second letter to the Corinthians, here in chapters 8 and 9, those who are going to take the gift, Titus and two others that we'll hear about, although they're not named, they're getting ready to come. And he wants the Corinthians to be ready. It almost sounds like he's maybe a little concerned that they might be flagging in their enthusiasm for this, and so he's pumping them up and encouraging them, although he does end up affirming his confidence that they will be very generous. But in the process, what he does is he holds up the churches of Macedonia as an example of generous giving. and they are a shining example of the grace of God that's exercised in giving generously. And he holds them up as an example to encourage the Corinthians to complete their donation and their participation in this ministry of giving to the needy in Jerusalem, those who have suffered in the region of Judea because of the famines. So that's where we're at. So with that background, I'm going to have us look at, start reading in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I'll start by reading the first 3 verses. And as I said, I am going to pause sometimes in the middle of sentences in order to draw out some points. So first of all, in these first this first set of verses through verse 6, we're going to see that he's what the practice of giving by the Macedonians consists of. I want to draw out some of those highlights. So here we go. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means. Now I want to stop there for a moment and just point out 2 things that Paul is highlighting about their example of giving. First of all, they're giving joyfully. There's joy in their giving. And that is and giving, that's the way giving should be. God loves a cheerful giver. And the Macedonians are showing a great example of they're just so happy. This is joyful and fulfilling for them to be able to give, even though they themselves are not necessarily wealthy. He talks about them suffering an ordeal of affliction. Whatever that specifically is referring to, it certainly underscores that they're not necessarily wealthy and have an abundance of extra to give, but they're giving, and they're giving generously. They're giving not only out of their means, but he says even beyond their means. And so that's I guess the second thing that I would say is not only are they giving joyfully, but they're giving sacrificially. They're not just giving, what they're not going to miss, and that's not going to, affect them anyways. They weren't going to use it anyways. No, they're giving even beyond their means. They're giving sacrificially. Okay, verse 4. Begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. So in other words, they aren't giving because they've been appealed to and pressed to give. It's actually the other way around. They said, hey, we want to help. They've been begging to help with this ministry. And so that's a part of the example as well. Not merely responding to what they were asked to do, but seeking to give. That's part of their example. And now I'll read verse 5. And this, not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us. And so another thing that they demonstrated in their giving, which Paul is holding up as an example, is that they gave themselves first to the Lord and to the work of the apostles, to the church, in other words. And this gift that they're giving, the generosity in participating in this ministry, is an overflow of their dedication to the Lord, not a substitute for it. That's an important point to make. Maybe it's tempting sometimes to think that, oh well, I don't really have very much to give to God or whatever, and I don't want to get too involved in the church, but you know what? If I give a bunch of money, maybe that'll make up for it. Well, that's certainly not what the Macedonians are demonstrating. They gave themselves first to the Lord and to his work and to the church and to what the apostles were doing, and then as a part of that, there is this generous outpouring of their giving, not as a substitute for their devotion to God, but as a part of their devotion to God. So he's pointing that out very clearly. And then verse 6. So that we might urge Titus that as he had already made a beginning, so he also should complete this generous undertaking among you. And so he's now going to talk about Titus, but what's interesting there is the eagerness and the generosity of the Macedonians has had an influence on others, on other churches, on other individuals. In other words, it's been contagious. And so that's why he's holding them up as an example. Look, you start giving generously and others will come on board, and it'll just spread like wildfire. And giving is a contagious thing. And so those are the things that Paul is holding up as an example, why Paul is holding up the Macedonian churches as an example. They are demonstrating joy in giving. They're demonstrating sacrificial generosity in giving. They're seeking to give, not just responding to a request to give. They're giving out of their commitment to the Lord and his church, and they're setting an example that others are following. So now we'll continue starting from verse 7. And in these next verses, he now is giving some further admonitions about giving to the Corinthians and to us, so that we can follow in this good example that he's holding up. So here's the admonition starting in verse 7. Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. So the idea is that we should be seeking excellence in giving, the same way that we would in teaching, the same way that we would in other areas of our Christian faith and practice. Giving is equally important, that we strive to excel in it and to do it excellently. That's the admonition he's giving. Verse 8, I do not say this as a command, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others. So as he's encouraging them to do this, he's not commanding them, that you are required to send a gift to the churches in Judea, to the Christians who are suffering in Judea, sending this gift to Jerusalem. He's not commanding them to do that as an apostle. I'm going to make it a requirement of you. But what he's saying is that this should just be a natural outflow of your love. You should be eager to do this as a natural outflow of your love. That's what he's pointing out in verse 8. Let's read verses 9 and 10. For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter I'm giving my advice. It is appropriate for you who began last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Okay, so he's saying what you're doing here, and the reason why this is important is because this is really a response to what Jesus has given to you. When you give to others, you're giving in the same spirit that Jesus gave to us. He He was rich, but he became poor. And as Paul explains in Philippians 2, he was God, but he poured himself out. He did not hold on to that. He instead took on human flesh and became one of us and submitted himself, humbled himself, and died on the cross. That kind of humility, that kind of gift, that kind of giving should then impel us to give to others in the same way. So give as a response to the example of Jesus giving himself on the cross. Let's read verses 11 and 12. I'm trying to stick close to my notes so we don't take up too much time tonight. We're covering a lot of territory. Verses 11 and 12. Now finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Okay, he's not worried at all that the Corinthians don't have enough to give. What he's maybe worried is that they're losing some of their zeal and their enthusiasm for this. So he talks about eagerness. Complete the work of giving with the same eagerness with which you began when you offered to give in the first place. Don't let your eagerness degenerate into, I guess we have to give, begrudging duty, or worse yet, to abandon your original intention of generosity. And we're going to see in the next chapter, chapter 9, verse 7, that Paul applies this same principle to the individual. In the same way as he's saying to the whole church here, don't give out of duty, don't give begrudgingly, don't give stingily, but be a cheerful giver. Give out of eagerness and willingness. Chapter 9, verse 7 says, each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So we're going to see that in the next chapter. He applies this principle to the individual, but here in chapter 8, he's talking about the whole church and the gift that they're giving. And then let's read verses 13 to 15. I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it is a question of a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. So what Paul seems to be emphasizing there is don't give out of pressure from the outside, but you should give generously from the overflow of gratitude for your own abundance. You have abundance to give, certainly by comparison to the Macedonians. The Corinthians have an abundance to give. Give out of that abundance. You have the means. It's only fair. It's not that there's pressure on you, but really, think about it. If anybody should be helping out the poor in Judea, it should be those of us who have the means, especially when there are those who are giving beyond their means, like the Macedonians, So he's not trying to set up a competition between, the churches of Macedonia and Corinth. But he is holding them up as an example, and he's saying, see what these churches are doing? Does that not encourage you and push you a little bit? And so I think that there is a little bit of that going on here. Now in the next section, Paul, starting at verse 16, verses 16 through 24, Paul commends the three who will come to Corinth and then carry their gift onward to its destination in Jerusalem. So he talks about this in the rest of chapter 8, and actually into the first 5 verses of chapter 9. But he talks about these 3 individuals here. There's Titus, and then there's 2 unnamed brothers. So Titus, he mentions in verses 16 and 17. Let me read that. But thanks be to God, who put in the heart of Titus the same eagerness for you that I myself have. For he not only accepted our appeal, but since he is more eager than ever, he is going to you of his own accord. So Titus, and he's trying to point out that, I haven't made Titus come to you. Titus has the same eagerness for this mission, this ministry, as Paul has. And that's why Titus is coming. And why are these other 2 brothers coming? So he mentions one of them in verses 18 to 21. Let's read those verses. With him, that is Titus, we are sending the brother, so this is another person, the brother who is famous among all the churches for his proclaiming the good news. And not only that, but he has also been appointed by the churches to travel with us while we are administering this generous undertaking for the glory of the Lord himself, and to show our goodwill. We intend that no one should blame us about this generous gift that we are administering, for we intend to do what is right, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of others. So, for the sake of integrity, there is a brother that's coming who has been chosen by the churches, who's been appointed by the churches because of his good reputation to be a part of the team with Titus and the other person who's going to carry this gift. So that's who he mentions there. And then in verse 22, here's another brother that he talks about in verse 22. And with them we are sending our brother whom we have often tested and found eager in many matters, but who is now more eager than ever because of his great confidence in you. So now this is now a third person. There's Titus, and now there's these 2 brothers. And this third brother that's coming is eager to come through Corinth because he has confidence in the Corinthians. And so Paul is pointing out, this third brother that's coming, apparently they know who these brothers are because Paul doesn't need to name them. But he's coming, and this brother has confidence in how generous Corinth will be. And so Paul is excited to be sending these 3 brothers. And I'm not going to read too much more because I don't want to run out of time. But you can read the rest of this chapter, and he encourages them. So welcome these brothers. They're doing this and helping you fulfill this ministry. And then the first 5 verses of chapter 9, the same thing. Now it is necessary for me to write you about the ministry to the saints, for I know your eagerness, which is the subject of my boasting about you, to the people of Macedonia. I'm not going to read that whole paragraph through verse 5, but he's basically saying, you hear me boasting to you about how Macedonia is giving. Well, I'm also boasting to Macedonia about how you're giving. Don't let me down. So he's giving them that encouragement. Anyways, I won't go verse through that section, but we'll start again in verse 16, because in verse 16, Paul now makes an individual application. In other words, he makes application to individual giving. Up to this point, he's been talking about the whole church in Corinth participating in this ministry as a congregation. But now he's going to take a principle of giving and apply it to the individual. And that principle is the principle of sowing and reaping. And he's going to draw some applications out of that for the individual. So let's look at verses 6 and 7. The point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So that's the principle of sowing and reaping. Verse 7, each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Now, we already mentioned that Paul challenged the church, to give cheerfully and eagerly, not out of compulsion, and now he's applying that to the individual. Give out of eagerness, willingness, and cheerfulness of heart, not out of duty and begrudgingly. Now let's look at verses 8 through 10. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. As it is written, He scatters abroad, He gives to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increasing the harvest of your righteousness. So God will supply your needs so that you will be able to give with abundance. If you've ever participated, if you've ever committed yourself to a ministry of giving, decided to be generous in supporting some particular work and to give of your means, to immerse yourself in it, or to make sacrifices in order to make a generous gift, you have learned this lesson, that God rewards you and God supplies your need so that you could give in abundance. He does that. He equips us to be able to give. And, God will pour more in so that you overflow, and you can't outgive God. That's just what happens. And of course, there's other scriptures that talk about that principle, but we're not going to take time to go to those. But this passage fits in with that principle. And then, so that's through verse 10. Let's look at verses 11 through 13. I know I'm racing through this. You will be enriched in every way for your great generosity, which will produce thanksgiving to God through us. For the rendering of this ministry not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also overflows with many thanksgivings to God. Through the testifying of this ministry, you glorify God by your obedience to the confession of the gospel of Christ, and by the generosity of your sharing with them and with all others. So, your generous giving brings glory and thanksgiving to God. If we're giving in the right way, if we exercise the ministry of giving with grace, okay, what happens is that God is glorified, and people will give thanksgiving to God. I mean, they may thank us, and, we should learn to be able to accept people's thanks for what we do. But if we're giving in the right way, it's not going to be about us. It's not going to be about making us look good to other people. But what it will be about is helping people to give thanks to God and to glorify God for His goodness. And we're just instruments of His peace and of His goodness and of His grace. Okay? But what people are experiencing when we give generously is they are experiencing the grace of God. That's what they're experiencing. And we need to communicate that and make sure that's the focus, and it doesn't become sort of a puffing up of ourselves. Oh, look at how good we are. No. Look at how good God is. And that's what Paul is emphasizing here, and that's a very, very important principle for us to maintain. And I'll just read out the verse 14. Well, let me start with 13 again because it's an awkward sentence break in my translation between 13 and 14, and I'll read to the end of verse 15. Through the testifying of this ministry, you glorify God by your obedience to the confession of the gospel of Christ, and by the generosity of your sharing with them and with all others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God that he has given you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. Giving like this, like the Macedonians are doing, like the Corinthians are encouraged to do, like we're encouraged to do, to give where people are in need. Giving is the exercise of God's grace among his people. I just this past Sunday preached in Weyburn on this theme of God's grace. God's grace is a noun, okay? And in this passage, it can also be described not just by the word grace, but thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. There's another noun for God's grace, his indescribable gift. That's a noun. What's the verb? If we are going to put into action as God's people, God's grace, what's the verb? The verb is giving. Giving. Grace is the noun, giving is the verb. And that I see as the lesson in chapters 8 and 9 here from 2 Corinthians. So I think that sets up well what I'm going to repeat and will probably continue to repeat this year as the theme by which I'm shaping this year in terms of how I'm going to live it out and try and follow God and his word. God's grace is for you in 2022.